Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I'm Luiza. I'm going to talk to you today about footnotes, and I titled this lecture Desire Paths, the Potential for Different Footnotes. When I first wrote the abstract for this talk, I wanted to investigate and contest the traditional placement of footnotes on the bottom of the page, usually small. And I was curious about how we got here and what footnotes do to authorship and power. And I propose that disrupting these standards can allow for multiplicity as opposed to one single truth, complicating knowledge, production, and ownership. So since I started looking into footnotes, some things have changed. And so I made a desire path of my own through the research. So I'm going to share this with you now. For a year now, I've been a graphic designer in residence at a place called the Institute for Studies of Latin American Art in New York. And part of my role in working with them is designing exhibition booklets. And I'm originally from Brazil, I should say, also. Our first project was for an exhibition called Threads to the South. And the show featured textile art, which is often deemed as craft or lesser than high art that belongs in museums. And the show pushed against this view and made a relationship between the medium of fiber with memory, longing, territory, and resistance. And this is how I received the content for the booklet, which was a curatorial essay with the main text bigger at the top and the footnotes smaller at the bottom. And this is the standard for text in Word or Pages or any other standard writing software. So my thought was for the design to change this hierarchy, bringing what was considered secondary information into the text, so weaving the footnotes into the body of the essay. Anytime footnotes were called, they appeared right after, in the same size, intervening on the text throughout the publication, and in turn making a unique pattern on the pages. Much like the exhibition, the booklet challenged expectations. What was deemed not important came to the foreground. And I think this is an example of how subverting standards in design or art can make us aware of those standards. And once we see them, we can think about if they were helping us in the first place or not. We can push for change. And I use this example in my proposal for this talk. And this is another case of footnotes that I included in there. This is from the book Type and Image: The Language of Graphic Design, written by Philip Meggs, who is a very famous American design historian who wrote this big history book called Meggs' History of Graphic Design. And this has become a part of the canon in the design education back in the US, which poses a lot of problems, which we can talk about later. But I only found out that Meggs worked and taught at VCU, which is where I'm teaching now, in Richmond, Virginia. So not Richmond, UK, to be clear. In this scan, I want to call your attention to two superscript numbers indicating footnotes. The one on the left, highlighted in yellow, is part of a paragraph that mentions Milton Glaser by name in there, while the other, highlighted in blue on the right, also speaks about a designer, but their name is not there on the page. At the end of the book, in the endnotes, we see Glaser credited again, and we find Sylvia Harris, for the first time, the designer who's missing from the main text, a Black woman buried in the footnotes, or in the endnotes in this case. And this example makes me think of the power that type hierarchy and structures have over readership and sharing of information, especially since history is not given, it's built. So how can footnotes amplify instead of reduce, or complicate instead of simplify? This is an example where Marginalia, in the case of Sylvia Harris, was used to marginalize, used to keep those who are not in power lower, separate. For my research, I relied heavily on these three books. They mostly focus on historical information with no images or formal concerns about the page. So this is why I see this lecture hopefully making sense as a contribution. This is The Footnote, A Curious History, written in 1999, and it has footnotes that are numbered and appear on the bottom of the pages. And this is my favorite, called The Devil's Details. It's from 2003. And maybe you can tell it's my favorite because of my own notes on the margins. It has footnotes on the bottom of the pages like the previous title, but these are separated from the text at the top by a line, which is also very common. And I also looked at this book a lot, Margins and Marginalia, the printed page in early modern England, which is all about what happens in the margins, and ironically has nothing happening there, almost nothing, except for page numbers and some headings. But the notes appear at the end of the book, they're endnotes. And I also came across many other sources, some very fun, unexpected examples. And I consulted with friends about their favorite footnotes, which I'll talk about soon. Take a picture of that one. It's good. So some say the main job of the footnote is to interrupt. So there are great quotes about footnotes. Someone said that reading a text with them is like driving over a road with potholes. Someone else said, a footnote is like a blind date, dreary occasionally, but often entertaining. And a footnote does not expect a long-term commitment. Whenever there's a footnote on the page, I am excited about the intrusion and the confusion, how different things happen at once. So imagine me, here I am as the main text, and I'm telling you these things. And then there's also another voice at the bottom giving you more information in case you're interested. Or I can be talking about something again here, and in the middle of the way, someone else takes the stairs to give credit or question what I was saying in the first place, but you know that someone else is me. Sorry, that was annoying. I was saying that sometimes footnotes can be disruptive because they speak at the same time as the main voice of the text and can challenge the narrator by presenting new information to the reader. Okay, you can understand what I'm doing here. There are voices on the page when we read, and we can control how loud they speak to us. It's not just about what they say, when, and how they say it. Right? So footnotes explain, give credit, share an anecdote, help define something. Here are some useful terms for us. And I've highlighted a couple parts. All of these definitions are coming from the Merriam-Webster dictionary. So a citation is a summons to appear when calling different things or people or places into the text. A margin is an area, state, or condition excluded from or existing outside the mainstream. It's a measure of difference. Marginalia stands for non-essential items. So is Sylvia Harris non-essential and Milton Glaser essential. A footnote is a note that is a relatively subordinate or minor part. So what does it mean to work within these definitions, and can we break from them to point towards new possibilities? Let's go back in time and look at how footnotes started. I'll show you some examples. We'll move fast. And one disclaimer is that I am not a historian, yet we will cover some history, and there will be many jumps in time and gaps in my telling, so don't trust me all the time. Mm-hmm. Welcome to the 12th century. This is the Glossa Ordinaria, a collection of biblical commentaries in Latin. And you can see the main text in the middle of the glosses or commentary around it. These are made by scholars of the Catholic Church, which maintains its authority by keeping interpretive power to itself. So people have been taking notes in books for a long time, but footnotes are sort of formalized marginalia. When notes are already there for you, people in place, telling you how you should read and you should understand. This is reminiscent of a Talmud, which is a central text for Judaism. Here you see commentary on the commentary, and so on and so forth from the center outward. And the first English Bibles were huge books made for lecturing for the congregation, so not for personal use. They were heavy, very difficult to carry around and to handle. Designers talk about the Gutenberg Bible all the time, but it has no footnotes, so I'm not going to talk about it. This is the Great Bible. It's from the 16th century. It's the first authorized edition of the Bible in English, authorized by King Henry VIII. And this is representative of church and state, so it feels symbolic to be in England for this talk, for Seven Leads. There are small notes around the margins, but mostly these hands, which stood for sacred passages that were not to be contested. And I find this kind of funny because the hands call so much attention to the passages that all I want to do is contest them. And it speaks to sort of an ambiguity of footnotes overall. You're calling attention to something else while at the same time maintaining your own power and knowledge. This is the Geneva Bible, which was a huge hit for many reasons, still in the 16th century. This Bible was affordable, easy to understand, with many notes. It's considered the first study Bible. It was published in many editions. And by this time, the Protestant Reformation had happened, so there were many interpretations of the Bible that proliferated. And these interpretations counted with notes that told readers how to make sense of the text. There is a conversation between text and margins, and we sometimes think of books as static or permanent, but they're actually bursting with activity. Footnotes are noisy, they sometimes contradict the text. Books are alive. And the Geneva Bible is also important because it's smaller in size, so people could read it at home, take it places. It wasn't for the congregation, it was for personal use. And in addition, there are many aids to reading here: prefaces, maps, illustrations, and even a dictionary for references. Also, this is the first Bible to number its verses and chapters. So this started here, so readers can reference them easily. So let's look at the first page of the book of Job here. There are many annotations on the page all around, sort of framing the text. The Bible that came after was the Bishop's Bible, and it's big again for lecturing, not personal book. And this Bible was produced under the authority of the established Church of England. So we can see Queen Elizabeth in the opening page. This Bible, in contrast to the Geneva Bible, is less interested in outside interpretation. It's interested in the government's interpretation. It's imposing and authoritative, and you can see it in the layout of the pages. If we look at the book of Job here again and compare it to the Geneva Bible, there's a slight difference. You can see that the footnotes are more grid-like. They don't drape around the text organically in the bottom. Everything is organized in fleshed out blocks on the Bible on the right. And I maybe naively didn't anticipate this intense association of footnotes with religion. It makes me think actually a lot about the association of printing with religion more generally. And that gives me the creeps and a lot to think about. But until this day, if you look for footnotes, even in other mediums outside of print, you will find the church. These are the first results you'll get if you look for podcasts in English about footnotes, all of religious nature. Don't worry, there are other things to talk about as we move on. We're now in the 18th century, and this book is called The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon, who was a historian. And footnotes appear on the bottom here in 2 columns. This is the Historical and Critical Dictionary by Pierre Bailly, who was a philosopher. These are the kinds of books that were written and published at the time, mostly by white men referencing historical events with dates, characters, details, all of which asked for footnotes. These 2 authors were fond of them, but there are other examples of scholars who were less interested in footnotes. This is a book by Reinke, who was a German historian, not a fan of footnotes. He had a major impact in his time and influenced how many books were written after. So this is important and sad to note because Reinke prioritized and taught writing that focused on primary sources only. So this is a very reductive approach to crediting and citation. So for a long time after this, books didn't have footnotes and didn't have credits. Jumping around, traveling through time, having a bit more fun now. This is Moby Dick, and an instance, the only one I could find of a footnote that includes an image inside the footnote. It's an engraving by Barry Moser. And you'll also notice that the footnote here isn't indicated by a number, but it's an asterisk. So this is up to the writer, sometimes publishers, and often there are many symbols used at the same time within one text, not just numbers or asterisks or daggers. We're in the 1950s, arrived very fast, and this is a poem by John Updike inside a story in the New Yorker. It's very conceptual. The poem is blank, and there are footnotes below. And at the end, we can read, "The empty space between the title and the first footnote is where the reader imagines the poem." So you see what's happening in these latest examples. Footnotes start being used in different ways creatively. There's experimentation that happens with the format, which is kind of exciting. This is a very beautiful example of kind of non-traditional text and typesetting. It's Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce, published in 1939, deemed one of his worst books by literary critics, but it's amazing for us. So what you see here happens in just one chapter of the book towards the end. The language doesn't make any sense. Nobody knows what's going on. The text reads like a dream or free association, and there are many notes that go with it. There are even music notes there on the left. And footnotes are numbered at the bottom and also free-flowing on the sides of every page. Pretty. In Species of Spaces, George Perec contemplates the many ways in which we occupy the space around us, including the space of the page. So this is a very reflexive footnote that reads, I'm very fond of footnotes at the bottom of the page, even if I don't have anything in particular to clarify here. This is the novel Infinite Jest, written by David Foster Wallace in the 90s. It has many, many, many notes. You can see there on the right page, the number 269. And then in the end of the book, in the end notes, we find 269. Very long and complex. And if we keep reading that end note, it has its own footnotes at the bottom. So this is an example of end notes with footnotes. And here the footnotes are letters instead of numbers. So it's a lot of back and forth reading this book, very active book. And I read that there's some contention between the writer and the publisher. Maybe this is also a good time to mention that sometimes marginalia decisions aren't up to writers or designers even, but controlled by publishers. A lot of publishers prefer endnotes to footnotes because of how challenging it can be to edit and fit everything in within the text. This book is called Marking the Dispossessed. It's a project by the designer Danielle Aubert from 2015. So Danielle collected 100 copies of the Ursula Le Guin sci-fi novel, The Dispossessed. It's a sci-fi novel from the 70s. She scanned them and made a version of the book that takes away the text, but leaves and compiled annotations and marginalia only. So this is about the lived experience of this book over time. It's a different way to experience the text. It's a way to experience the text without it, but through another kind of representation of feeling. So, like at the beginning, I mentioned I asked some friends for their favorite footnotes, and I will show them to you now as we get to the end of things. These are, in a way, the footnotes of my lecture. Other sources sharing views of their own that I'm including in my view of things. And this makes me a little uneasy because it deals with the ambiguity again. I'm crediting people and making you aware that I didn't arrive at this lecture alone. But at the same time, I'm the only one here presenting, and we can't see the others. So I think being aware of this conflict is important to continuously negotiate our relationship to authorship as designers. Julian Bittner came to my class at VCU last week and shared his footnotes for the book The Bevel and His Blues. He said, with our limited budget, I had to make this quite a compact book. He also said, I don't think I've set footnotes in such a narrow column since. This example was sent to me by Doug Scott. The book is designed by Ellen Lupton and Abbott Miller, and it's about the arts and crafts movement in Boston. Sometimes footnotes are set in the same size as the body, a different typeface. Sometimes they're illegible. Sometimes they're at the top. This book chapter has no footnotes, with the exception of one at the end that reads, "Reader, please forgive the radio silence. I'm not in the habit of interrupting women when they are speaking." These are scans from the Whole Earth Catalog, which was a counterculture magazine and reference tool in the US in the 70s. Some people see it as an early prototype for the internet. And in the publications, there's this black cat that jumped into portals, making links between ideas, inviting readers to go to other pages. sort of like footnote-like behavior. And I learned about this with Mindy Sue a few years ago. And this is a project she worked on last year, a website where the main focus is the hyperlink. So everything's a hyperlink, which I think is the equivalent of the footnote online. It's how one references other information, sources, etc. But the challenge here is that, people say that links can stop working on the web. But kind of my thought about that is that books don't really last forever either, so it's fine. But just the other day, a student shared this picture with me, something she saw at the rare book collection at the Library of Alexandria in Egypt. So it made me look into Islamic law commentaries from the 17th century. So we're back in time again. And what attracts me in these pages is the quality of everything kind of all at once. We talked about simultaneity a little bit before at the start of the day, right? So this is a hierarchy that challenges a main channel or a linear view of things. Things happen simultaneously and we decide where to go. And speaking of simultaneity, the last example I'll show you is a book by Corita Kent called Footnotes and Headlines. And here, there's a conversation between footnotes, small text, and headlines, big text, borrowed from advertisements. But it's not always clear which one takes the lead. Sometimes our expectations are subverted. So it's a nonlinear experience that perhaps captures a lived, real environment more than an ordered one and lets us decide our way in. In the 90s, Tibor Kalman and Terry Jacobs wrote, "Inappropriate design is a way of making people think about why they like what they like and how they learn to design or to like these things." So looking into footnotes pointed me to many design hierarchies that privilege the status quo, the main text, one view. And today I want to invite you to disrupt this, right? There isn't a one fits all. There isn't even a one fits most. A desire path stands for an alternative route that isn't a prescribed official one. And I think alternative footnotes can help us challenge existing systems that aren't working for us, that exclude. But things aren't as simple as they seem. Sometimes being in the margins means casting aside, while other times it's protecting, keeping it a secret, safe from the main road. So it's up to us to consider these relationships over and over as we design. So how can typesetting of footnotes emphasize plurality to undermine authoritative discourse? What happens when content that lies on the periphery interferes with the main channel? And what if instead of traveling through established paths, we looked for other ones? Yeah, thank you. Peace and love. Do you have questions?
Maybe I've got a question. Hello. It's a really great talk. Thank you. I suppose my question, it's not really a question, it's more of an observation. It's more an observation of, the technology that we're using now. The footnote function in design is always putting things at the bottom and doesn't allow for any of these other kind of more wacky or even just putting things at the top or the side it's more just the how we're free in many ways now to do lots of things, but actually the technology stops us. So I was marveling at the Arabic example that you showed. I was just like, oh my God, that is insanely insane. So it's really more of an observation about technology and how we think page layout software now gives us lots of options. It does in many ways, but also I feel that it also gives you lots of constraints that we're fighting against. So it's not really a question, it's an observation.
Yeah, it's a lot more work to fight this lander than to follow it. Yes, for sure. Yeah.
Force for Menka was well, this in the folklore could reign the bilingual editions of books are also voiced in very recently, often like the poetry, depending on which language you speak, then the other language is more of the kind of footnote that you don't really read, but maybe you're like, and
Totally, yeah. Yeah. I didn't include in this lecture. It's maybe I'm hoping to keep this going, but there's a lot of also examples of things that happen at the same time. Like I'm very interested in theater, for example, in scripts or scenes that happen at the same time, and how plays are published. That's very different than what happens on stage in terms of simultaneity. And it kind of involves that, or like how do you know how to read what at what time? Yeah, that's a cool case of like if you speak the language or not. Yeah. Yeah.
I wanted to ask, with your publication where you actually embedded the footnotes into the text, as like, I guess as a designer, did you notice any kind of greater activation happening than perhaps a traditional footnote practice? And like, if you have any examples of that, maybe.
Yeah. What do you mean by greater activation?
Like in the sense of greater activation between the footnote and the text, like rather than it being two separate entities, did you notice there was like more potentiality for perhaps explanation or explanation?
Yeah, for that, yes. Like it was almost for that project, it was almost as if like the curator was trying to make a claim, but all of the artists were being like, hey, 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 at the same time. So it gave the reader a sense of how full the exhibition was. It's actually not very known, the pieces that were shown in the exhibition. So I feel like the effect made it so it was very glaring how much of that type of art there was. We just don't know about it. So in that way, it was a very disruptive reading experience. And some of the footnotes I didn't focus on them, but they were like links to references. And so you'd be reading the essay and there'd be like 4 lines of just like an HTTP, like a link. So it was kind of frustrating, but that was also the kind of mood of the show, right? These people were frustrated and they were demanding to be recognized. So in that way, it gives a sort of kind of feeling. And so I'm all for that. I think these kind of challenging hierarchies can promote feeling as opposed to organization or clarity. Yeah. Yeah.
I was going to ask you, you showed that digital example of the sort of web page with all the hyperlinks. Did you come across like other examples of a lot of those examples you showed were like founded by a page, and like that just was safe, allowing you to locate the footnotes somewhere relative to the text. Is that a problem online when you've got to scroll, and how do you consider that?
Yeah, it's interesting because I didn't focus so much on the digital side of things. Because technically, there are even different terms, right? Like one could say that a hyperlink in the digital footnote is a hyperlink, but we could, is it really? I don't know. But I think kind of the rules then change where things get lost. You can kind of rabbit hole much easier on the internet and things get lost. And yeah, but yeah, that's something that maybe perhaps is missing is also examples of notes that happen in the same page of a website, for example, where the references are there for you. Yes. Much to figure out.
What's your view on hyperlinks in proofs? Can I ever have a poetry? Is that always?
Yeah, I wonder if this is similar to what you're talking about. Maybe I'm getting it wrong, but I debated showing books that have like choose your own adventure books, which this is big in America. I'm not sure if it's a thing here, but books that have many different routes. And depending on what page you're on, it says continue to page 4, continue to whatever. And yeah. And I don't know. I've always enjoyed liking those books and you keep coming back to them because the story changes all the time, which I feel like is more reflexive to how we live, right? Everyone's experiencing this topic in a different way. It's not a one view. We never can see it the same. So I don't know. I don't think that answers, but
I was thinking that when you have a citation.
Oh, hyperlinks, you mean like, I like to include them because don't they look weird? I don't know.
Yeah.
Like yeah. I think let's read them. Yeah. All right.
Okay, great stuff.
Is there one more question?
There was.
Someone. I was just gonna say, we like recently did a project, where like Majesty, we did a project with like responding to a third called fucking the error.
Mhm.
He's like, he focused on kind of diagonalism and stuff. And I was just thinking like, with that example I showed with, wasn't Danielle, yeah.
Yes.
Do you see like, footnotes almost being like just translations like an interesting thing.
Totally.
Or it's literal, but like, footnotes almost the translation of the main text in that sense. I don't know.
Yeah, or it's another text altogether.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I do see it like that. I didn't get time to totally go into it, but the book with the footnote that says, excuse my language, fuck in the beginning, that book is sort of like a queer history book. And there's a second story that's omitted by the main text and it's told through the footnotes because it's safer to exist smaller than the bigger size. So I didn't have time to get into that, but that's one example where footnotes offer an opportunity also to hide something that you don't want seen. But yeah, that's interesting. Cool. All right, I'll get out of here. Thanks, guys.